My name is Jason Alari. I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Side of Carroll County. We're delighted that you're here with us this morning. We're also delighted to have Elizabeth Plume Fuss here with us, Libby. I'm going to read her bio and introduction, and then we'll get started. Today's BLT is sponsored by Mel and Linda Mills. We have an opportunity now, if you know a speaker or you're interested in the topic, if you'd like to sponsor one of our BLTs, you can come see me, talk to the staff, and we acknowledge that person at the BLT, acknowledge you, and we're very grateful for that support. Elizabeth Libby Plume Fuss is a registered nurse with a Master of Science degree in Nursing Health Policy. She retired in 2014 after a 45-year career in pediatrics, nursing management, and as Director of Infection Prevention and Employee Health at Carroll Hospital, University of Maryland Medical Center, and Johns Hopkins Hospital. She has authored articles for nursing and infection prevention journals and spoken at national meetings. Elizabeth has been an avid reader all of her life, especially biographies and historical novels. Finding her father's World War II letters to her mother was a great joy that she felt called to share with others through the publication of A Faithful Soldier Writes Home. Born and raised in Martinsburg, West Virginia, she has lived in Maryland since 1977 and enjoys her family life with her husband, 2 sons and daughters-in-law, and 2 granddaughters. Thank you, Libby, for being with us here this morning. We're delighted that you're here, and I'll pass the mic on over to you. Can we have a round of applause, please?
Thank you. Everybody can hear okay? Great. Thanks to the Historical Society for asking me to come. I didn't realize it was a BLT. I knew it was a box lunch call. I like that, BLT. And a special thanks to Lynn Wheeler for coordinating this. Lynn has been a huge supporter of my book ever since it was first published, so I have appreciated that so much. A Faithful Soldier Writes Home is primarily a compilation of letters that my father wrote to my mother during his time in the U.S. Army in World War II in Europe. And I found them in an old suitcase, which is on the table back there, after my mother passed away, I found these letters and many other things in the old suitcase, including Daddy's medals, which are also on the display back there. And I'd be glad to talk with you later about those things. There were also letters from my uncle, Roy C. Coons, who was in the Army Air Corps, and various letters and historical documents, that some of which are in the appendices in the book. There we go. My father enlisted in November of 1942, and he was discharged in November of 1945. He served as a chaplain's assistant in the 331st Infantry of the 83rd Infantry Division, known as the Thunderbolt. He served in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany, arriving in Normandy on D-Day +12, was when the 83rd arrived. And they served in the liberation of France, the Battle of the Bulge, and stayed on in Germany as part of the Army of Occupation. When I give talks about my book, I try to think, well, what aspects would the audience appreciate most? Sometimes I focus on a newspaper article that was written by now the late John McVeigh. And he said it's partly, quote, a love story, a lump in your throat love story about a man far from home, in the direst of situations, missing his beautiful, devoted wife and their wonderful life together. Or sometimes when I'm leading worship services in churches, I'll focus more on Daddy's experience as a chaplain and some of the prayers that he wrote that's in the letters. Or if I'm speaking to a group of veterans, there are certain excerpts that I feel like speak to them. For your program, I thought, well, you're interested in history, so I would try to highlight some of the historical aspects of the letters and to help provide a first-hand perspective of what it was like for the soldiers. This is Lester, my father, and Chaplain Webster at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, in 1943. Daddy spent most of 1943 there, and that's where most of their training took place. And in April of 1944, they headed over to England. Oops, I hit one. Okay, and this is Lester with the chaplain's Jeep. And I learned from the letters that one of his duties was the upkeep of the Jeep. And I never remembered him talking about that. This is my mother, Ruth, and she had a bigger picture of this on her dresser for years and years, and she had told me this was Daddy's favorite picture of her. Well, this one, you can notice that it looks a little worn, and that's because it was glued to the back of a prayer card, and he carried it around with him in the war. These prayer cards were wallet-sized photo cards, and a family member filled it out and gave it to their soldier, and it said that I will be praying for you at this time every day. While they were in England, which is where this photo was taken, in the spring of 1944, prior to the Normandy invasion, Daddy and 3 other men were in charge of the PX tent, and that's the tent. And they sold candy and cigarettes from the tent. I'd like to read an excerpt from a letter written from England. And he says to Mother that he had an opportunity to visit one of the towns that had been given a hard bombing by the Germans. And he says, honey, I can't begin to describe it. Places where once stood 6- and 7-story buildings are leveled off flat. You see signs quite often stating, this was the site of some large building. You can go down Main Street and see whole buildings with the tops off and burnt completely out. The only thing standing is the steel framework. And then he says he got on a bus and was traveling around the town, and he met an Englishman who invited him to his home for tea. And he said, I've always wished for the opportunity to talk to a family who went through the Blitz. So he went with this English gentleman. He writes, they said that the house next to theirs was hit. When the bomb exploded, it shook their house so badly that every window was broken. All the pictures loosened from the walls, beds turned upside down, and the plaster was horrible. They went through this every night for quite a long time. And when the sun came up in the morning, they could always see new destruction. Quite often when they would go to work, they would see the rescue squads pulling out arms, legs, heads, and all parts of bodies, and sometimes whole bodies of men, women, and children. And unfortunately, we're seeing that type of thing in the news again. So these are the 4, including my dad, who served at the PX tent. And in a letter toward the end of the war, my father says that of these 4 who staffed the PX tent, 2 were killed, One was seriously wounded, and he was mildly wounded. In a letter written after the war in Europe, you may know, since you're into history, that Victory in Europe Day was May 8, 1945. He says, there are, quote, not more than 10% of the fellows left in our regiment who were with us when we left England. And in those 10%, there is not more than 2% who have not been wounded at least one time. Quite a toll. I think this picture shows several aspects of a soldier's life. That's Daddy on the ground, and his caption says, "I am reading one of your wonderful letters." Now, I always knew that it was good to write letters to soldiers who are far away from home. But one thing that really, one thing that really struck me in reading my father's letters and my uncle's letters was how important it was for them to have a letter that they could answer. You know, they were limited in what they could write, and I'm sure it was easier to sit down when you had the time to compose a letter, to have a letter to respond to. The mail also was rather sporadic, which is certainly understandable as this army is moving across Europe. It's surprising things got through and packages got through as well as they did. But sometimes days and even weeks would go by and he would put in a letter, "Again, I didn't get any mail today." And then he might say, "I got 10 letters today." The letters share aspects of daily living. This picture, you may be able to notice the pup tent in the background there. Not much of a shelter. But here are some examples of his daily life at times. This was written just after they landed in Normandy. He says, "I had to put some finishing touches to my slit trench. The way I have it now, it would take nearly a direct hit by a shell to harm me. I will try to explain to you how I have it, so you can envision this. First, there's a hole in the ground, about 3.5 feet deep. Over the top of it, I have 4 pieces of timber, about 3 inches in diameter. Then I have boards on top of these pieces taken from a wooden gate. Then I pulled off enough grass to cover the cracks in the boards. Then I have about 4 inches of dirt on top of the grass. Then I laid the fence posts on the top and covered them with more dirt. In the front, I have an opening just large enough to crawl into, and the back has a place where I could easily kick loose if I had to get out that way." Now, I'm not sure if that was supposed to reassure Mother or not. I'm not sure it did. He also writes in July of 44, "I have been issued some clean underwear and a clean shirt. So, as soon as I finish writing to you, I'm going to wash and put them on. My underwear became so filthy, I just tore them off about 3 or 4 days ago. And this shirt is so dirty, it's stiff. So I know I will feel better when I put the clean clothes on." Well, that was in the summer. And then, during the Battle of the Bulge in the winter, he writes, "I have the opportunity today to try to take some kind of a bath. Today was the first I have had an opportunity to clean up since December 4th, when I had my last shower somewhere in Luxembourg. Since that time, we have been either on the line or moving so fast, We did not have time to get a bath. He wrote that on January 22nd. Hadn't had a bath since December 4th. One of the worst times for the soldiers was the Battle of the Bulge. Fierce fighting in the worst winter in decades in Belgium. The dates of the Battle of the Bulge are December 16th, 1944 to January 25th, 1945. And in the old suitcase, I found there was a booklet, an extensive tale of the Thunderbolt across Europe. And I found it interesting that their account was even as bad as, or worse than Daddy's letters described it. In this booklet it says, "More than the mere Germans, we fought the weather. Those winter days when snow fell like powder without pause, when the sweat of our dirty bodies froze our clothes to us. Our knuckles were raw and bleeding, and our lips were cracked. Our noses ran, and our eyes were blinded by the whiteness that was everywhere. Our feet were wet and frozen and numbed with pain. The walking that had to be done was agony. When we could use our mess kits, the once hot food was icy, the coffee useless. And in the howling wind of the afternoon or the cutting blast of the night, it was painful to use a latrine. For most of us, sleep was a thing beyond our being known. There was time for nothing but fighting the enemy." Well, it was during the Battle of the Bulge that my father earned his Purple Heart and his Bronze Star for Valor. A Bronze Star that has a little V on it, I learned, is for an individual act of valor. And I'd like to read the account that he shared with Mother of how he earned that. He says, "It was on a hillside in Belgium, one which I shall never forget. The third time I went up there," and he means he had to go up a hill where he was rescuing wounded soldiers. He says, "The third time I went up there through at least a foot of snow under constant shell fire is the one I am writing about. I volunteered to do this because at that time they did not have enough litter bearers to take care of the casualties. Men were up there dying, and I could not sit by and do nothing. After walking about 2,000 yards, we finally found this man lying in the snow in virtually a pool of blood. Of course, it looked more than it actually was on account of the red snow. This fellow had his hand blown completely off, a large hole in his shoulder, and a few slight wounds on his legs. Just as we got him on the litter, there were a few artillery shells hit about 50 yards from us. We picked him up, and after we carried him about 100 yards, they hit close to us again. That is when I was hit on the leg. And I know there were at least 25 rounds that hit within 50 yards and closer in that half an hour. We had to stop for a few minutes because we were just played out. Then this boy said, 'If you help me, I can walk, and for God's sake, let's get out of here.' Well, dear, I was already played out, but when he said this, I said to myself, 'Man, if you have that much nerve, I'll carry you till I fall over.' So I told Andrews, the fellow who was with me, to carry the litter, and I'd go with the wounded man. Andrews was already played out, so he said, 'I'll catch up to you,' and laid there in the snow until he was able to get up. And I will never forget the next 300 yards. About the first few steps we took, he asked if I could pray, because he had already prayed so much and he wanted to hear someone else. Well, dear, I believe, in fact, I know I uttered the most sincere prayer in my life there, dragging, struggling through a foot of snow, shells hitting close, and soaking wet with blood on the outside and sweat on the inside of my clothes. I know that God answered that prayer, or I wouldn't be here today. When I finished, he grabbed me by the arm and said, "We'll make it now." Moving back a little in time, the caption on this picture says, "The first friendly group of people we met," and that was in France. And you can tell from the letters that Daddy made an effort to interact with some of the local folks. And this is a story from France. He says, "I had quite an experience yesterday. A farmer nearby was thrashing his wheat. 2 of us walked over to watch them. We saw that they could use some help, so we pitched in. I would say we worked for about 3 hours. I know I got a few blisters on my hands from it anyway. I find that the French people appreciate anything you do for them. It was worth the labor to just see the expressions and actions of them. It really made them happy to know that an American soldier would help them. The man on the farm, or I should say the one who seemed to be the boss, as we were leaving, hit us on the back, and I think he said, 'Good boys.' We shook hands with the whole family and returned. Even though I have a few blisters, it made me feel pretty good." And a few days before that, he had written, "The other day there was an old lady left in this small village all alone. She had a small shrapnel wound on her hand, and I offered to dress it for her. While I was dressing it, I discovered she had a broken wrist also. We gave her something to eat, K-rations, and left some bandage and powder and tape to redress her wound. We asked her to be evacuated, but she refused by saying her daughter would soon return. I hope she will get aid soon, after things settle down in her locality. We did all we could for her for the time being, anyway." And the caption on this one is "The Kiddies and Myself." My father loved children. He had not had any before the war. My parents had been married for 7.5 years, but had not had children. They had 3 of us when he got home. But he writes in August of '44, "These little French children are really fine youngsters. I have found out you can use one word around the world and it will attract children. That word is candy. I had a package of caramels in my dinner ration today and gave it all to them. I was really having a wonderful time showing them my helmet, pen, and wristwatch. I had a short pencil in my pocket and a booklet in French, so he asked them to write their names on the back of the booklet. And they were having a real time when I would pronounce their names. If I wouldn't get it correct, they were quick to tell me. But then later, when I would call them by their names, they would smile and shake their heads, yes. But best of all, dear, was when I showed them your picture. I can say too, dear, that these French kiddies would really love you because they all kissed your picture." One special relationship that he established was in Luxembourg. His part of the army were in Luxembourg for a month, about a month or 6 weeks in the fall of 1944. And he was able to stay with this family in their home, which was quite a blessing. And the child on his right, her name is Marie-Jeanne Ehrlich, and she was 4 years old when that picture was taken, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her later. He says to Mother, he's writing from somewhere in Luxembourg. He couldn't, of course, say exactly where. We moved into this new area in the afternoon. After I knew we were going to stay there for the night, I looked for a place to park the Jeep, under cover if possible. I walked back into an alley and found a place between two buildings, just about large enough to put the Jeep, and the buildings on both sides concealed it very good. While I was parking it, this little child, who was a little excited, was continually getting in my way. So I called her over, picked her up, put her on the front seat. Then I parked the Jeep where I had planned to put it. Being a child, she did not want to get out. So I picked her up and carried her for a few feet away from the Jeep. Then her mother came up around the house. And of course, anybody who would see their child with a soldier, it would bring a smile. Then, about that time, her father came upon the scene. He could understand a little English, could speak French and German. So with his English, and myself being able to understand a little French and a little German, we could partly carry on a conversation. He invited me into the house and showed me the bedroom I could use if I cared to. I got permission from the chaplain to sleep here. And this is a picture of Mrs. Ehrlich. Sanny was her first name, and Daddy's holding little Marie-Jeanne. Well, when my father was with this family, he had what he described as a very bad cold. I think it may have been pneumonia. And they took excellent care of him. They didn't even let him out of bed for a couple days. They brought him his meals, and the little Marie-Jeanne, he writes in one letter, she called him Uncle Lester. And she said her prayers at night that Uncle Lester would, in the morning, would feel better. And this is a picture of the Ehrlich family in June of 1945 when the Army came back through Luxembourg, or he had the opportunity to get there. And he writes in June of 1945, when I stopped over in Luxembourg on our trip, I found out little Marie-Jeanne does not have any shoes. Well, she has one pair, and they are nearly worn out. These people, dear, cannot buy any shoes for her because they are not available. And since one package a month can be sent to people in Europe from the States, excluding Germany, I thought it would be a wonderful gesture on our part for you to find her a pair of shoes and send them to her. I am enclosing a string for the size. The long string is for the length, and the short one for the width. Do not get them any smaller than this. In fact, a little larger would be better because she is growing. So, I do know that the shoes got there because in the suitcase was a thank you letter from the Ehrlichs. And my sister and I don't remember, Daddy didn't talk about the war much, but we both remember the story about the little girl and the shoes and the strings. Well, after the book was published, I began thinking, I wonder if Marie-Jeanne would still be alive. I contacted the Luxembourg embassy, and they located her. She's 82. I've spoken to her on the phone several times. She speaks English, bless her heart, and French and German and Luxembourgish. And she always apologizes for her English, and I say, Marie-Jeanne, don't apologize. I don't speak anything other than English. So my husband and I are going to try for the third time, if COVID or a war doesn't intervene, to go to France and Luxembourg and Belgium and meet Marie-Jeanne. I want to tell her in person that I truly believe that personal care that her family gave my father helped him to enter the Battle of the Bulge a healthier man and could have saved his life. The 83rd Infantry, again, I'm going backward a little bit, but they launched their first direct attack against the Germans at Saint-Malo, France, on July 4th, 1944. And I'd like to read an excerpt from a letter that Daddy wrote that day. Dear sweetheart, I hope the censor passes what I have to write in this letter. I only wish I had someone like you, or better still, if I had you to come to right now. I need your comfort so much. Yes, so much that I can't begin to describe it. Right now, I feel like crying like a baby. You see, the chaplain and I are working at the forward aid station. I have seen men come in today in all shapes and conditions. I worked mainly with the men who were not physically wounded, but came in nervous wrecks. In fact, if you would let them go, they would just double up like a roll of jelly. I have given away about 6 canteens of water to these type men. I would lay them down, wrap them up, take the tight clothing off them, and talk to them a while to do all I could to console them. I never thought I would see big, strong men cry like they did. I would also take the less serious wounded back to the rear aid station where they would later be sent to the hospital by ambulance. When the statement was made that war is hell, I don't think it was exaggerated any. But not everything was sad and deadly. I'd like to read a favorite story of Lynn Wheeler's, and we call it The Chicken Story. This was written in July of '44. We really had a feast yesterday evening about 8:30. Near the place where we are, there were, underlined, 2 black hens roaming around. I told the fellows those chickens worried me, and if we could find a pan, we would have stewed chicken. Well, I found a good-sized kettle, scoured it out with soap and water, caught and killed the chickens, heated some water in this pan and scalded them. 2 of us picked them. Then while 2 of the other fellows were cutting them up, I washed this same pot again, and the infection control nurse in me is saying, good, Daddy. He washed the same pot and put in some water. We could not build a fire because it would make too much smoke. So, and he had described this technique to Mother in a previous letter, I got 2 empty ration cans, filled them about half full of dry dirt. Then I would soak this dirt with gasoline that he got from the Jeep. When this was put under the kettle, it would really heat it up with very little smoke. I boiled the chickens for about an hour and a half, adding some onions and potatoes, which we found in a garden close by. Fortunately, we had plenty of salt too. So, with the chicken, cookies, and fortunately, I left this part out, Chaplain Swartout had received some packages. So with the chicken, cookies, and coffee we made, we really had a grand meal. A couple additional historical things about the 83rd. They liberated a concentration camp. It was a work camp, or as Daddy described it, a slave camp. And he described a little bit, not a lot, the terrible conditions, the wooden bunk beds, the emaciated people that we are accustomed to seeing. But He also wrote a more uplifting description of seeing folks on the road. And this was April 9th, 1945. And he writes, "The other day I saw these people walking down the roads with small bundles, very poorly dressed. It is nearly impossible to describe it, but just imagine seeing people of practically every nation in Europe, Russians, Poles, French, Belgian, Czech, Dutch, and others walking along the road 2 and 3 feet wide for at least 10 miles, pushing carts, very ragged and tired looking, but happy that they have been set free. Some of them even managed to sew cloth together, making the flag of their country." He also described an encounter, also toward the very end of the war, and he had been talking with Mother about the fact that the Jews were terribly treated and had to wear the stars on their clothing. He says, "Here is one of the most peculiar incidents I have ever seen or experienced. The other day I was repacking and doing a little work on the Jeep, and he describes that this lady with a small child was crying, and they came up to him, and he says, she told me she was from another city here in Germany, and they'd been on the road for about a week and hadn't eaten for 2 days. That is what I could understand from her German. And of course, I just assumed she asked me what could she do. Well, the night before, we took over a German home, and luckily the people had returned that evening. So I told her to come with me. When I entered, I found out the old man, who was about 60 years old. That's not old, but to him it was. He was 30 at the time. Anyway, this old man could speak a little English. Now here is where I got a little mad. When I told this old man her story, he said he didn't have anything. And I knew all the time he was lying, because there were about 6 cows in a shed behind the house, and a flock of chickens, and a whole wagon load of potatoes. Then I told him in no uncertain terms to give this child and woman something to eat and a bed to sleep in if she cared for it, and I was going to come back in about an hour to see if he had done it. And all the time I was patting on the .45 pistol I carried. When he saw I meant business, he could not do enough for her. Here is the peculiar part of this incident. An American soldier, who is the enemy of the Germans, forcing one of them to give another German something to eat and a place to rest. He also talks about having had a conversation with a school teacher. At one point, twice he went to Paris, but this was again after the fighting had ended, and he drove the chaplain to Paris. And he and another soldier were on the street, and a lady came up to them and asked if she saw their camera and asked if she could take their picture. And he says, when she snapped the picture, we started a conversation. She was a school teacher, and I thought here was my opportunity to find out how things were under the Germans. They were supposed to devote 1 hour each day to teaching National Socialism. She said, though, that school teachers in France have a way of teaching just about what they want to. In other words, she taught them what is not right as well as that which is right. So when the Nazi supervisors would come around, her children could always answer them what is not right. And they did not ever have to lie, because the Nazis weren't interested how it was taught, but only if the children knew it. And she said she has found it very interesting to teach directly opposite to the old custom and way. It was also something I was not aware of, but he writes a letter on May 13th, so this is post-VE Day, and he says to her that the war is over as far as I am concerned for the time being. Of course, there is that constant threat of being shipped to the Pacific is the reason I say it is over for the time being. So many of these soldiers were under the understanding that they might have to go to Japan after they have fought this war in Europe. But there was a point system, and Daddy, having been in from the beginning, he would talk about, he's adding up his points. You needed 85 points, and he could be discharged. And his Bronze Star points, I think that earned 10 points, and that put him over the top. His discharge papers say he was discharged with 86 points. But many did not have to go to Japan, as we know, because of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There was also, in 1943, a contest by the Worldwide Broadcasting Foundation, and soldiers were encouraged to write an essay on the topic, What I Am Fighting For. And I found in the suitcase that my father's essay was one that was chosen. There's a letter from the Worldwide Broadcasting Foundation that it would be broadcast, and there was a copy of the essay, which I didn't know. Daddy had never told us he wrote that essay. Well, this is my uncle, Roy, my mother's youngest brother. He was 5 and she was 12. They grew up in Hagerstown when their mother died, so she was very close to Roy. His letters and some letters about him are in chapter 10 in the book. I didn't say the first 8 chapters are Daddy's letters, then I wrote a chapter of my experience having found all this, and then Uncle Roy's chapter. Now, Uncle Roy didn't write or spell as well as Lester, but his story is certainly worth knowing about. He had extensive training as an engineer and gunner on B-24 Liberator bombers. His 36th Squadron was based in England, and they were known as the Carpetbaggers. And they flew secret, very low altitude missions at night over occupied territories. And they dropped supplies and agents. And I've seen a B-24 Liberator, and there's literally a hole in the middle of the plane that things were dropped out of. Well, the plane was hit by flak and exploded over Belgium in the early hours of June 6, 1944, and Roy was killed. The pilot survived and sent a letter to my grandfather, which is in Uncle Roy's chapter. Roy was 22, and he was engaged to Louise. She went on to marry and have children, but she stayed in touch with my mother's family. And after Victory in Europe Day, my father researched and was able to find Uncle Roy's grave in Belgium. But his body was later sent to the United States, where he's buried in Hagerstown. There was a letter in the suitcase where the families were given that option. And to conclude Uncle Roy's chapter, I wrote, Roy did not get home, never saw his caring family again, and did not live to marry his beloved Louise. My mother told me that even though it didn't diminish her grief over the loss of her little brother, after his death, she had a sense that her other family members in the service, Lester, my father, her brother George, her brothers-in-law Joe and Gib, my father's brothers, would get home safely. They did, Louise continued to be a friend of Roy's family. When my mother died in 2006, Louise came to her burial in the same group of plots where Lester and Roy are buried. She introduced herself to me and seemed pleased that when she told me her name, I knew that she was Uncle Roy's fiancée. Okay, we'll go back to... So, I hope this has provided some insight for you into the life of World War II soldiers in Europe. I'd like to know if you have specific questions or want to know more about some of the things I mentioned, or additional things like censorship of the letters or whatever. So, I believe the microphone is going to be brought around. When the family was here in Carroll County, and my uncle years ago told me they're somewhere buried in Union Bridge, but I never found their graves, and Uncle Gibb isn't here anymore that I could ask him. Your second question was about the pictures. Well, Daddy had a camera, and he also talks about, there was Joe Clay was a soldier with him, and Joe was badly wounded and was taken, away. He got back in touch with Daddy later, but Joe asked my dad if he would keep his camera for him. So I think and he wrote to Mother, it's a really nice camera. But he did eventually get it back to Joe, I believe. But so between the two cameras, he did have, the ability to take pictures. Now as far as film, she sent him some film in the packages. But it was a convoluted process, apparently, because he could not send her any pictures until the censors approved them. So somehow he would mail the rolls of film, no digital cameras in those days, the rolls of film would be mailed, and then I think they came back to him, and then he had to send them to the censors, and they would approve the ones, or maybe they sent them on directly, that I'm not sure, but it was kind of a process. And the pictures somehow got separated from the letters because Mother had this bunch of pictures that my sister, my brother, and I went through when she moved. She lived her last 5 years with us. But anyway, when I found the letters, then I'm thinking, oh, I have that picture, I have that picture, I have that picture. So, good question. Anybody else over here?
Yes.
I have a microphone now.
And it was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Would you say something, were any of the letters redacted that you found in the suitcase? And my other question would be, could you talk a little bit about your father's education, that he was such a good writer?
Okay. First of all, I'm glad you asked that because I did bring something with me. Apparently Daddy had a pretty good idea what he could and couldn't write, because there were not many of the letters that were censored. But I always have to be very careful with this, and hopefully if I put it up against my jacket, you can see. Now this amazes me because somebody took great pains with maybe an X-Acto knife to cut out what couldn't be, it wasn't a magic marker over it, but look how careful they were with it. They did not mess up the integrity of that sheet of paper. And it's still that way all these 70-some years later, so I am careful. But there were a couple that it was cut out of like that. And I've often said to folks, I think I would like that job. You get to read people's letters and you'd do a good job of cutting it out. As far as, now what was your next question? Oh, his education. Well, interestingly, my dad only went through the 8th grade in the Hagerstown area with his basic schooling. His father died when he was 12. My mother's mother died when she was 12. His father died when he was 12. and he had to work to support the family. He did eventually get his GED, and around the time they got married, he took some courses at Hagerstown Junior College, it was called at the time, and he has some certificates for public accounting. He never went on to become a CPA. He worked at the post office in Martinsburg after he came home. But I don't know exactly where he got the skills as a writer, other than, he was an avid reader, and I, taught us the importance of reading. And I like to think I learned a little bit, I have a little bit of that in me. And our son Joshua, our younger son, Josh was one of these kids in elementary school that if you had to write sentences for spelling words, if he could do it in 2 words, he would. And I'd say, Josh, you're supposed to show that you know what the word means. Mom, it doesn't say that. Well, now, he and his wife live out of their truck camper, and they're right now visiting Maryland. We haven't seen them in 2.5 years. Anyway, but Josh writes a blog and writes of their experiences of moving around and working in these national parks. And he's a great, beautiful writer. And he looks a lot like my dad, too, so I think that filtered in. Okay, anybody else? Yes?
Loud voice, but I should use the microphone.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It's very interesting to me because I have about 2,000 letters from World War II, half of which are from my father to my mother, and the other half are from her to him. Did any of your mother's letters, do they exist for you?
Very few. He explains to Mother at one point he can't keep her letters. He would keep some a little while in the Jeep, but they did not have room. I could not keep her letters. There was one. Everything that I had of hers, I put in the book, and I dearly would love to have her letters because he'll talk about. She wrote poems to him. And there's one of her poems is in the book on a card that he had kept. But I have very little that she wrote to him. Anybody else?
Sir. Here you go.
As an enlistee, how did your dad end up being assigned to chaplaincy if he wasn't a ministerial student or involved in ministry in some way?
Well, I'm not real sure, but in his very early letters, when he's at Fort Lee, Virginia, I think is where he went in, and I don't know that I could find it quickly, anyway, he tells Mother that I think they had some kind of an opportunity to say what they would like to do, and he must have said he would like, that was maybe one of his choices. So he was a chaplain's assistant, not a chaplain, because he did not, have the education to be a chaplain. But he writes in the letter that he was really happy, that he got the job that he was hoping he would get. But he was also obviously right in the thick of the fighting. For one thing, one of his medals, or it's the badge, it's the Combat Infantryman badge. And in reading about that, I've understood that you had to be in combat to receive the Combat Infantryman badge. And one of the things, so I had to read up on these medals because I had no idea when I found them in the suitcase. The Bronze Star has, if you look at the medal, it has a little thing on it called an oak leaf cluster. And that meant he received 2 Bronze Stars, but some were given to like a group. And then others were given for an individual act of valor. And if that's the case, there was a little V. So that's on but anyway. So I guess he was fortunate, maybe in his group coming in, there weren't too many that wanted to be a chaplain's assistant, I don't know. He talks in the book that he wanted to be a pastor. He was hoping to become a minister when he got home. Well, he was discharged in November of 1945, and my sister was born in August of 1946, 9 months later. So I asked my sister, I said, did you know it was that close? And she said, well, Mother told me one time it didn't take long after Daddy got home. So I'm sure he then could not afford, to not work with a family coming. He was encouraged to become a very active layman, which he was in the church. But anyway, I think he really did embrace the chaplain assistant role though. Okay. Well, if you're, oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much for a beautiful presentation. Thank you. And let's give Libby a round of applause. Libby does have a wonderful trunk of artifacts over here, and also she is selling copies of her book. So Libby will make her way over here, and we invite you to join us over there at the table to see the artifacts that she's brought. Libby, do you want to say any more about them?
No, not really.
All right. Then thank you all
Thank
so
you.
very much for coming, and please come over and meet Libby and talk to her. Thank you.